Well, I guess today it's a good day. It is a good day to be with God. And today we're not going to be in the book of Judges. We actually finished that last week, so we get to go somewhere a little different today. But before we get into the word, let us go before God in prayer. Father God, I love you. You are good, and let your word resonate in our heart today. Lord, what you have for us, the words that you would have spoken, Lord, let them be spoken, and let them find good soil in the hearts of all of us here today, that we may grow to be more of who you have called us to be, that we may grow in righteousness, that we may grow closer to you and deeper relationship with you. And Lord, in the midst of contentious times, Lord, I pray that you would bring peace to your people and that you would show us love and compassion so that we may show love and compassion to others. Lord, I ask this in your mighty and your precious name. Amen. So as we draw closer to an upcoming election, I have some thoughts that I want to share with you on the status of the country. I'm not talking about the political landscape. Don't worry, I'm not going to be giving you some big political speech today or about the economy or anything like that. I have my thoughts on those, but this is neither the time nor the place for that. But we do live in a great country. And the fact that we have a voice and a vote in how our country is governed is a blessing. And I want each of us to take part in this process. But with that in mind, there's some unfortunate ugliness that is being brought to the surface in this election. There's always been disagreement over how we should govern. Each person is going to have a little bit different of an opinion on a wide range of issues. This is normal, and I would even argue it's healthy. And those disagreements can force us to look a little more closely at our own positions and see the weaknesses in them, or see some of the value in another position. However, in the last several years, the division that has come over political matters has been heartbreaking to me. I remember when Democrats and Republicans could agree that we all wanted what was best for the country, we just disagreed over how best to get there. This was echoed by the people of the country. We may have disagreed with each other, but we still knew that we were all on the same side fundamentally. Now each side is calling the other a threat. Of course, there are bad actors on each side, but not all people who disagree with us are themselves bad. And I think in a lot of ways we have forgotten how we should treat people, especially people that we disagree with or people that we don't like. With that in mind, I think it is appropriate to address that very topic today. We've been teaching in youth, actually, the parables of Jesus, and the one that was taught this week I thought was so appropriate for where we are right now that I wanted to bring it to you as well. Today we are going to be looking at the parable of the Good Samaritan. This is one of the most popular and well-known of the parables of Jesus, and for good reason. It teaches us a very deep lesson about how we should act as followers of Christ and what it means to be a neighbor. This parable is found in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 10, verses 25 through 37. But before we get into the parable, I want to ask you guys some questions. Now, you don't need to answer these out loud. I simply want to get you thinking. I simply want to have you be thinking about and have some images in your mind, because it might help you go through this parable and shine a light on some of the preconceptions and prejudices that we may have that we are unaware of. So here are the questions that I want you to consider. If you were to find yourself in need, what kind of person would you expect to help you? Now, I'm talking about outside of friends, family, people that you know. I'm talking about strangers. I'm talking about what kind of person, if they were to find you on the side of the road in need of aid, who are the people that you would expect to stop and help you? Possibly police, firefighters, churchgoers, Democrats, Republicans. Who would probably be and on the other side of that, I want you to think to yourself, who would be the last kind of person that I would expect to actually stop and help me? I want you to be honest with yourself as much as you can in your own mind. We all have blind spots. That doesn't make you a bad person if you say that there's a certain kind of person that you wouldn't expect to help you. But I want you to be honest with yourselves as much as possible, because what you are thinking in your mind may reveal a lot about your preconceptions and your prejudices and who you view as a neighbor and who you may not view as a neighbor. And I want you to keep all of this in mind as much as possible as we go through this parable. To start, I want to set the scene for you. In verses 25 through 29, Jesus is teaching to a crowd, as he often does. And he is approached by an expert in the law, meaning an expert in the Old Testament scriptures and all the rules for life that come from them. This lawyer has a question for Jesus, but this is not asked out of a genuine desire for knowledge. Instead, he is asking to test Jesus. Whether he's trying to ask Jesus a question that he can't answer and to discredit him, or to simply see where he stood on the issue, is unclear. But this man is someone who knows his stuff already, and he wants to know where Jesus stands. He asks a question that's been on the hearts and the minds of men for ages. How do I get to heaven? How can I reach paradise? In other words, it is, how can I be righteous? Because righteous people are the ones that go to heaven. How can I be considered righteous by God? This was a very common question that was asked to Jesus, and was probably a common question that was asked to most of the teachers of the law in Jesus' day. It was such a deep and profound question that Jesus himself was actually asked this question 4 times in the Bible that we know of. Jesus, as he often does, responds to this question with a question of his own. In Luke 10, beginning in verse 25, said, "And behold, a certain lawyer stood up and tested him, saying, 'Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life?' He said to him, 'What is written in the law? What is your reading of it?' So he answered and said, 'You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself.' And he said to him, 'You have answered rightly. Do this, and you will live.' But he, wanting to justify himself, said to Jesus, 'And who is my neighbor?'" Now, some of the things that you need to understand right away are who this guy is and how he views himself. He is a lawyer, or some translations of the Bible would call him a scribe. These were scholars of the Old Testament, well knowledgeable. They knew the scriptures backwards and forwards. And they would probably quote large sections of it to you at the drop of a hat. This meant that, by extension, they were experts of the law. And the law is how you attained righteousness in Jewish eyes. So scribes or lawyers were seen as righteous people. And we can see already that he has a well-formed opinion on how righteousness is achieved. And Jesus tells him that he's right in his assessment. This lawyer does an excellent job of summing up the law and all the instructions that God had given them into 2 basic rules. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And love your neighbor as yourself. He doesn't find it necessary to cite the 10 Commandments or any of the other 613 laws that the Jews had to govern their lives. And just in case you are wondering, that's not a number I pulled out of the ether. That is the actual number of laws that they had. These summations of the law come from Leviticus 19:18 and Deuteronomy 6:5. And they were common simplifications for the entire law. Because the thought was that if you could do these 2 things properly, then naturally you're going to keep the rest of the law. So hearing this, the lawyer asks a logical question. Who is my neighbor? That's what I would want to know. If these were the requirements of being considered righteous, love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. That one seems pretty self-explanatory. I got that one. But in order to love my neighbor as myself, I got to know who my neighbor is. And as it says in the Bible, this lawyer is also trying to justify himself. Because as an expert of the law, they also had a strong view already of who their neighbor was. In their mind, their neighbors were other righteous people. Other people who believed the way they did. Other people who followed the law like they did. And the unrighteous were not their neighbors. And therefore, they didn't fall under this rule. We didn't have to love them as ourselves because they're not our neighbors. They're not like us. And he wants Jesus to affirm this position because then he can walk away justified and confident in his own righteousness. He's an expert of the law, so he's seen as a righteous man, and he wants to maintain that status. We may not realize it, but many of us, I believe, have fallen into this same line of thinking. That people that we agree with and people that agree with us and think like us, those are the good people. Those are the ones that are like us. And the ones that don't, those are the bad people. And see, that's the first step. The same kind of thinking that this lawyer has started with the people that believe like me, they're the good ones. And the people that don't, they're the bad ones. Before you know it, it turns into, well, I only have to really treat the people that like me and think like me well, and I don't have to do that with the rest. Now, Jesus decides to answer this question of who my neighbor is with a parable. Now, Jesus is going to go against the prevailing wisdom of the day and teach them a different view of who their neighbor is. And we are going to start with verses 30 through 32. And I want to stop partway through so we can address how Jesus is structuring the story. You may not realize it, but Jesus is setting them up for quite a gut punch of a twist in this story. So in Luke 10, beginning in verse 30, it says, "Then Jesus answered and said, A certain man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and fell among thieves, who stripped him of his clothing, wounded him, and departed, leaving him half dead. Now by chance a certain priest came down the road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. Likewise a Levite, when he arrived at the place, came and looked, and passed by on the other side." So Jesus tells a story. Says there's a man who falls into the hands of robbers, a man who finds himself in need. Then a man who anybody would consider righteous in those days, a priest, comes along. He sees this man in need, clearly in need of aid. And he looks at him and he goes, not touching that one, not dealing with that. I'm just going to go by on the other side, pretend I didn't see it, move on like nothing happened. Then a Levite, who is also considered righteous, who is also considered a teacher of the people, does the same thing, sees this man in need, and goes, not for me, not doing it. Two outwardly righteous people came upon a man in need and did nothing. Now, I want to put that into perspective for you. I asked you earlier, who were the kind of people that you would expect to stop and help if you were in need? What kind of stranger would stop and help if you were in need? What would you expect? Maybe it was a police officer. So to put that into to modern perspective, that would be like saying there was a man in need on the side of the road. A police officer comes upon him, just looks at him and is like, nope, not going to help that one, not dealing with that. Or whoever else it is that it was in your mind that you say, that's a good person, that's a righteous person, that's somebody that would help. Put that person into this story in place of the priest, in place of the Levite. That is what Jesus is telling him. He's saying the best people that you can think of did nothing to help this man. Now, the reason why these men did nothing is kind of an interesting one. And of course, everybody would expect them to. But they came upon this man and they see him as half dead. So why would a priest, a good person, not do anything to help? Well, maybe it's because this priest thought he was dead and there was nothing that he could do. And in fact, if he touched that dead body and tried to help, he could be considered unclean. And this would have been a huge problem for a priest. To be unclean would mean that he couldn't be in the temple for synagogue or the Sabbath. And that would be a huge problem for a man of his standing. See, many times what stops us from helping others is because we are worried about what the cost might be for us. Not necessarily in money, possibly, but in standing or in public perception. Like this priest could have easily been worried about. It could have damaged his social standing to have helped this person. So rather than risk that, let's just stay out of it. When a person is in need, do we first stop to think about what helping this person might cost me? If so, I hate to tell you, and this might be harsh to hear, but that means your kindness comes with a price tag. And if the price tag is too high, then you may very well pass on the other side of the road, just like this priest did. The Levite, who also would have been considered righteous, doesn't stop either. And as I alluded to earlier, the prevailing wisdom of the day was that you would consider other people who were righteous as your neighbor. In other words, another person would have to prove themselves to be a neighbor to you before you were expected to treat them as a neighbor. To put that into a more modern perspective, that would be like us saying today that I understand I'm supposed to treat people with love and kindness, but I'm only going to do that for people who believe what I believe. If they don't have my political beliefs, or they don't have my religious beliefs, or they don't have this other stance that I hold, I'm not going to treat them well because I don't have to, because they're not the same as me. Now, I know none of us would outwardly say this, and the notion that that could be possible would probably cause you to scoff at me. You'd probably think, I would never do something like that, Pastor. Come on. We all know that we're supposed to treat everyone well. We know we're supposed to love everyone. We're supposed to love our neighbor as ourselves, right? And we're all neighbors, right? Well, we all understand that in theory, but what happens when the rubber meets the road? I'm sure this Levite said all the right things about treating his neighbor well too, and would scoff at the idea that he would ever do anything different. But here, when a man was actually in need, he did nothing. We all say the right words but when we are put in a position to put action to our words, are our actions consistent with our words? Or do we pass by on the other side of the road because we don't know what this person believes, so we don't know if that person is worthy of our help? If you stop to think if this person in front of me is worthy of my kindness, then your kindness is reserved only for a certain kind of person. And if that person is not of that certain kind, then you would leave them on the road the same way the Levite did. In this story, Jesus has already gotten the attention of the people by having two seemingly righteous people do very unrighteous things. This would be like if you were being told that story, like I said, with those people that you would expect to help, and they haven't. Your head would be filled with questions, like why would that person not stop to help? Maybe they had a good reason. Jesus had the group in the palm of his hand at this point. They're hanging on his every word because he's telling them something that just doesn't make sense to them. And he is about to hit them really hard. He's setting them up because he's using a storytelling device that was common in Jewish culture at the time. This is where in a story, three people would come into a story. And the first two, like this priest and Levite, would not be the hero of the story, but the third person that would enter would be the hero. And they know this, so he's already had the first two characters come in, and they weren't the hero. But now they're eagerly awaiting this third person who's going to be the hero. And I'm sure they were all perked up and wondering. They're like, oh, it wasn't the priest. It wasn't the Levite. It's got to be someone big. If they weren't the hero of the story, it's got to be somebody amazing. I'm sure they're thinking maybe it's somebody great from their past. Somebody like David or Moses or some great prophet like Elijah or Isaiah. I mean, it'd have to be, right? I mean, if it wasn't the priest, it wasn't the Levite, it's got to be somebody great. Maybe it's even their high priest. Who knows? Instead, in verses 33 through 37, Jesus finishes his story and shocks the crowd with his third man. It's not some great hero of the faith. It is instead a person that would be considered unrighteous. It's someone that not only would they consider unrighteous, but it was somebody that the Jews actively hated. It was, I'm sure, probably the last person that the Jews would have expected to be the hero of the story. In Luke 10, beginning in verse 33, it says, "But a certain Samaritan, as he journeyed, came where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion. So he went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. And he set him on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. On the next day when he departed, he took out 2 denarii, gave them to the innkeeper, and said, 'Take care of him, and whatever more you spend, when I come again, I will repay you.' So which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to him who fell among the thieves?" And he said, "He who showed mercy on him." Then Jesus said to him, "Go and do likewise." Now, in order for you to understand the weight of what has just been said, in order for you to understand exactly the weight of what Jesus has just told these people, you need to understand just how much Jews and Samaritans hated each other. A Samaritan wasn't just like a non-Jew, because Jews already looked down on people who weren't Jews, and they were considered unrighteous. But a Samaritan was quite possibly the worst person a Jew could think of. The reason for this hate is that the Samaritans were at one point Jews themselves. They were from the northern kingdom of Israel after the split that happened between Judah and Israel. And then Israel was conquered many years before this by the nation of Assyria. And the Assyrians moved out some of the natives of Israel and moved in some of their own people. This was done in an effort to prevent rebellion. Now, one of the things the Jews were meant to do was keep their bloodline pure, meaning a Jew should only ever marry another Jew. After all, these are the people of God. You would want to keep your bloodline pure. Yet the Samaritans didn't do this. They started marrying all the foreign people that were brought in by Assyria. And in the minds of the Jews, this made them worse than all the other people around them, because they were meant to be the people of God, and they had compromised on that. They gave that up just to be like other people. It was so bad that Jews and Samaritans would go out of their way to avoid each other. I mean, if they were traveling, say if a Jew was traveling to a city, and they say, well, I could take this path, and I could get there in a day, but I would have to pass through a Samaritan village to do it, or I could take this other path that would take me 5 days, but I can avoid that filthy Samaritan village. They would gladly take the longer path just to avoid the Samaritan village. And trust me, the animosity went both ways. The Samaritans hated the Jews just as much as the Jews hated them. It was so bad that they wouldn't speak to each other. When Jesus, in fact, he came into a city and he sat down near a well to rest, and there was a Samaritan woman there, and he asked her for a drink from the well. This would seem like such an innocent and normal interaction, even between strangers, that you're like, okay, yeah, you sit down next to a well and you say, hey, could I have a drink? I've been traveling a long time. I'm thirsty. And this Samaritan woman is taken aback because she's like, why would you, a Jew, speak to me, a Samaritan? She's shocked by the fact that he's even talking to her. That is how much these people hated each other, that they wouldn't even associate with each other. So for Jesus to say that a Samaritan, the people they hated the most, to be the hero of his story would have been shocking and controversial at least. Samaritans were the unrighteous. They weren't neighbors in the eyes of the righteous Jews. Not only did the Pharisees and scribes and all the other religious leaders of the day, they elevated righteousness and piousness to an art form. They would appear perfectly religious on the outside, but they had also perfected shunning and looking down on those who had been deemed unrighteous. They were humans, but they weren't humans like you and me. That's how they viewed the Samaritans. They were really good at looking down on the unrighteous, and the Samaritans were really far down there. So the Samaritan was a hero. A perfect illustration of this tactic that the Pharisees would use, to where they would shun people, is actually in another parable that Jesus teaches. In Luke 18:10 through 12, Jesus is teaching about self-righteousness, and he painted a scene that was very familiar in those days. It said, 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood and prayed thus to himself, God, I thank you that I am not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even as this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all I possess. This is how the Pharisees viewed themselves. They were the righteous. They were the good people. And everybody else, they could be treated as subhuman because they were the unrighteous. And the Samaritans were the worst of the bunch. Yet this Samaritan does all the righteous things that the good, righteous people should have done. And he takes care of this man's needs, unlike the righteous priest and the Levite. I would even argue that this Samaritan goes above and beyond what should be expected of him, what any rational person would think to do. He not only bandages his wounds and gets him to a town, but he also uses his own funds to make sure that this man is cared for. And Jesus asked this expert of the law, who asked the question in the first place, who was the real neighbor here? And just as another little note to drive home the animosity between the Jews and the Samaritans, notice how this man, this Jewish expert of the law, can't even bring himself to admit that the Samaritan was the good guy on the story, that the Samaritan was the neighbor. Instead, he says the guy that helped him was the neighbor. Jesus tells him that he should do the same. The implication here is clear. If we want to do the will of God, we have to love God first, and we have to love our neighbor as ourselves. And our labors are not limited to the people that we like. And they include the people that we don't. It's not just the people that agree with us. It's not just the people who are righteous like us, as the Pharisees of the day believed, as the righteous of the day believed. It's not just the people who are like us and believe like us. It's everybody. The people that society tells us that we are supposed to hate, those are the people that we are supposed to love. The calling that we are given to treat people well is not limited to the people that we like. It's easy to treat the people we like well, but laws and standards exist for the people that we don't like. The reason God tells us to love our neighbor as ourselves is because he knows that sometimes it's hard to do that. It's easy to love the people who love you back. It's easy to treat the people well who treat you well to begin with. But when God tells you love your neighbor as yourself, he's not just talking about the people that you're already going to treat well on your own. He's talking about the people that your heart and your soul and your flesh don't want to treat well because they're not like you and me. But those are the people that we need to treat like neighbors. Those are the people we need to go out of our way to treat well. And I want you to understand that Jesus is also completely changing the perspective on the man who asked him the question. The assumption had always been that in order for people to be considered neighbors, they had to prove themselves to be neighbors to you first. But Jesus is telling everyone here that we are expected to be neighbors to others, regardless of how they treat us, regardless of who they are. Even if we disagree with them, we are to treat them well. If we seek to be like Christ, we are to treat all people well. Not because we like them, but because we love them, as God has first loved us, and God also loves them. We don't have to agree with the wrong things that they do in order to love them. This Samaritan didn't have to agree with everything this traveler ever did to help him. In fact, this Samaritan knew very little about him, but he chose to help him anyway. It is possible that he knew this man was a Jew. That would mean this man would have been hated by the Samaritan himself. But Jesus also turned another preconception on its head. This lawyer who is seeking to justify himself is trying to get Jesus to say, yeah, you don't have to treat others well unless they treat you well first. But Jesus puts the expectation on us. He shocks them with his choice of making the Samaritan the hero, and then he got them to think. He didn't ask who the traveler should treat as a neighbor. He asked who the neighbor was to begin with. People don't have to prove themselves worthy of your kindness and your compassion. Even if we know that the person doesn't like us, even if we think if the roles were reversed, they would not treat us well, it doesn't matter. The standard that Jesus gives us is clear. Even the worst person that you can think of is your neighbor. And as we go into this election season and all the tense emotions and thoughts that it will naturally bring, I want each of us to keep this in mind. We should be praying for all the people of this country, not just the ones that we like. We should be praying for our leadership, Republican and Democrat alike. I know it's tempting to repay evil with evil, but we are called to more than that. I want us to be mindful of our hearts and our thoughts in this process as well. We might think that we're not going to go off on someone, we're not going to treat them outwardly evil, so that's enough. But I want you to remember that God is concerned with our hearts and our motives, not just our actions. If you're cursing one side of the political aisle or the other in your heart and your mind, that is still taken seriously by God. It is fine to have your positions. It is fine to fight for those positions. I encourage you to do so. In all this, I don't want us to forget who we are fighting against and what we are not fighting against. Our fight is not against the people on the other side of the aisle. Our fight is against evil ideas. Our fight is against spiritual authorities and powers that are at work behind the scenes. These people on the other side are not our enemies. It is the spiritual nature behind them that is. It is fine to condemn an idea, but remember that the person is still made in the image of God and is therefore worthy of some love and respect. And if we treat them with love the way that we should and the way that we would want to be treated, much like this expert of the law said at the beginning, we can sum up the rest of the commands of God in that. Love God, love your neighbor as yourselves, and everyone you come across is your neighbor, even your enemies. We are meant to bring light to the world. I think we can all agree there is far too much darkness in the world today. And we need to be agents of light, not fostering more darkness. Let's not treat those outside of these church walls badly. That's a bad witness to the good God that we serve. Instead, I want us all to remember these words of Christ from Matthew 5:16. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. Us treating those around us as neighbors with love, with compassion, is a form of witnessing to them. Even in the most divisive and contentious of times, let's be good neighbors to everyone that we come across. I know it's easy to see some of the wicked positions that we see that they hold and try to treat them as evil. But remember that we are to love our neighbors, and even those that disagree with us are our neighbors. Yes, we can pray that God would have his will done, And we can pray that things may go our way. But remember that these people are still our neighbors and are still worthy of love and compassion because they are loved by God. The evil that they support may not be, but they are loved by God. And so we should treat them with that same love. Let's pray. Father God, I love you. You are good. And you call on your people to be good and to show love and compassion to those around us. And Lord, it is hard when we see people who we believe to be evil, who disagree with us, who believe things contrary to what we believe. It is easy to treat those people poorly. It's what our flesh wants to do. But Lord, I pray that in those moments that we would remind ourselves of who you are and who you have called us to be. That you have called us to love our neighbor as ourselves. And that our neighbors are not limited to the people who believe like us, who look like us, who think like us. But our neighbors are anyone we may come across. So Lord, I pray we would treat others well. That even in the most contentious and divisive of times, that we would remember who you have called us to be. That we would love you with everything we have and love our neighbors as ourselves. Because they are created in the image of God. Even if we find ourselves on the different side of the political aisle. Even if they believe something different. Lord, that does not mean that their beliefs are right or good, but it does mean that they are still a person worthy of love and respect. And so may we remember that, and may we treat them as neighbors, as a witness to the God who we serve. I ask this in your mighty and precious name. Amen. I love you guys. Treat your neighbor as you would want to be treated. It's the golden rule. It comes from the Bible. And never forget that even those people who are different than you are still your neighbors. I love you. Go and have a great